Hello, I'm Montse Alvarado. EWTN News In Depth is next.
The president meets the Pope. It's a major moment for America's second Catholic president, but it comes with some controversy and critique. A report from our Vatican Bureau.
Being able to see the humanity in each of us is really how we can do good work and lean on the goodness and the beauty that's within all of our traditions.
Reaching across religions to find common ground, how followers of different faiths can work together to promote peace for all. We remember a groundbreaking Catholic document that helps set the tone between Catholics and non-Christian religions.
During Advent, we look at every saint day and we celebrate each saint leading up to Christmas.
A Catholic mother shares how she incorporates faith into her homeschooling curriculum. We look at the latest numbers reflecting tremendous growth in home education. And we go down under in the Roman catacombs as we remember the faithful departed and prepare for All Souls Day. EWTN News In Depth is next.
You are the most significant warrior for peace I've ever met.
A pope and a president, a private audience for America's second Catholic president with the pontiff in the Vatican's Apostolic Palace. Welcome to EWTN News In Depth. Though they've met before when President Joe Biden was vice president, this was his first visit with Pope Francis as leader of the United States. Often characterized as the most overtly religious president in decades, this was no doubt a highly personal interaction for Mr. Biden. However, because of his political stances on several issues that go against Catholic teaching, the visit was met with particular scrutiny, as Vatican Bureau reporter Colin Flynn explains.
U.S. President Joe Biden arrived at the Vatican's Apostolic Palace at noon today for his much-anticipated meeting with Pope Francis. He greeted Vatican officials, saying it was good to be back, before being led inside to meet the Holy Father. Now, this is the fourth time Joe Biden has met Pope Francis, but the first since becoming president. There was a warm rapport between the two most senior Catholics in the world as they posed for pictures and exchanged gifts. Pope Francis presented President Biden with a ceramic tile depicting the iconography of a pilgrim, as well as a collection of the Pope's main teaching documents. In return, President Biden gave Pope Francis a woven chasuble, which was made in 1930 and was from the archives of the Holy Trinity Church, the parish that he frequents in Washington, D.C. Now, President Biden also presented Pope Francis with what's called a command coin, normally given to someone as a recognition of exemplary leadership. "You are the most significant warrior of peace I've ever met," he said to the Pope. And after exchanging the gifts, the two held their private meeting. And it's interesting to note that no independent journalists or camera crews were permitted inside for the meeting of these two, and a planned live broadcast of the initial greetings and exchanging of the gifts was cancelled just yesterday. Instead, the media were provided with edited clips of their interactions afterwards by Vatican media. The meeting between the two ran over time to around 75 minutes, more than double the normal length of an audience with the pontiff. The Pope's meeting with President Trump lasted 30 minutes in 2017. It is said in the meeting they discussed climate change, poverty and the coronavirus pandemic, and also touched on the loss of the president's adult son. But for many Catholics, what was more significant about this meeting was not what was said, but more what wasn't said. All eyes were on this meeting between the President and the Pope because Joe Biden is Catholic, in fact, the second Catholic United States President in history after John F. Kennedy. But for many Catholics, particularly in the United States, they find it hard to reconcile how he can profess to be a devout Catholic while at the same time his administration supports and advocates for greater access to abortion, which of course is fundamentally against the teachings of the Catholic Church. Now, Joe Biden has said that while he is Catholic and personally opposed to abortions, he cannot impose his own religious beliefs and opinions on other people, and they must be given the choice. In return, some Catholics have said Joe Biden should be refused Holy Communion because of this. However, when asked, Pope Francis said that communion is not a prize for the perfect. Communion is a gift, and that bishops should use compassion and tenderness with Catholic politicians who support abortion rights. So this was the elephant in the room today, and people were wondering if Pope Francis would speak to President Biden about the issue. The Vatican did not say if they did. However, when questioned by reporters afterwards, President Biden said that Pope Francis told him he was, quote, a good Catholic and that he should keep receiving communion. In Rome, Colm Flynn, EWTN News In Depth.
God love you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
The president's meeting with the Pope was just the beginning of 5 days of global meetings with world leaders. On Saturday, the G20 summit begins in Rome with the leaders of the world's most advanced economies, though the leaders of China and Russia will not be attending in person. Among the most pressing topics are pandemic vaccines inequality, climate change finance, and energy prices. Then it's on to the Global Climate Summit in Glasgow, Scotland. Earlier this week, prior to the G20 summit, the climate summit, and meeting with Pope Francis, President Biden met with the spiritual leader of Eastern Orthodox Christians, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, at the White House. Bartholomew says he urged the president to seek environmental justice at the climate summit for the planet that we all share. And he said Mr. Biden thanked him for the decades he has spent promoting interfaith understanding and cooperation. The divide and tension between religions has spurred war and violence for centuries, but a papal encyclical written almost 60 years ago has sought to strengthen understanding and build interfaith dialogue. Reporter Mark Irons explains that document, known as Nostra Aetate, and how it is helping to spread the idea of brotherly love between Catholics and non-Christians.
When Pope John XXIII opened the Second Vatican Council in 1962, he called it the supreme interest of the Council that the sacred deposit of Christian doctrine would be guarded and taught more and more effectively. With that goal in mind, Vatican II produced 16 final documents. One of them, Nostra Aetate, was a declaration on the relation of the Church to non-Christian religions. The document highlights what the Catholic Church and non-Christian religions have in common, those connections. For example, the fact that early followers of Jesus Christ were Jewish. Nostra Aetate summarizes, the Church, therefore, exhorts her sons that through dialogue and collaboration with the followers of other religions, carried out with prudence and love and witness to the Christian faith and life, they recognize, preserve, and promote the good things, spiritual and moral, as well as the socio-cultural values found among these men.
Nostra Aetate was a groundbreaking document.
Bishop David Zubik of the Diocese of Pittsburgh believes the document helps set the record straight on the deep roots of Judaism found in Catholicism and corrected any historic blame Christians have placed on Jews for the death of Christ, creating a mindset of animosity toward Jewish people.
I think what the document was able to do is say, wait a minute, we're all responsible for the death of Jesus because our sinfulness.
Nostra Aetate also examines Islam, recognizing that Muslims acknowledge Jesus as a prophet, honor the Virgin Mary, and they value the moral life and worship God, especially through prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. This week marks 56 years since Nostra Aetate was proclaimed by Pope Paul VI. We asked members of non-Christian religions to weigh in on the Vatican text.
We're worshiping in different ways, but sharing the same prophets and many of the same stories.
Abdulmalik Merchant is an imam, a leader in his Islamic community in Alexandria, Virginia. He shares a reverence for the good found in different faiths.
I'm Muslim, my theology is Islam, but I love finding the beauty and the truth and all of these things in different traditions.
Daniel Mark is a practicing Orthodox Jew.
I think that Jewish moral values are very closely aligned with Catholic moral values.
Mark is living out a mission to promote truth in education. He's a professor at Villanova, a Catholic university.
I think the church is an extremely important institution in our world because of the role it plays in teaching and promoting the truth.
Finding common ground between followers of different faiths can translate into promoting peace for all and help provide healing during tragic times. Bishop Zubik says his diocese in Pittsburgh has a historic, close relationship with the city's Jewish community. And when a lone gunman's anti-Semitic attack killed 11 people inside the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, giving support came naturally.
It's a friendship that exists between our people. I know that there's just a very friendly spirit that exists between us.
Going forward, Bishop Zubik says much work still remains to live out the call of Nostra Aetate. The document concludes in some of its final words, "We cannot truly call on God, the Father of all, if we refuse to treat in a brotherly way any man created as he is in the image of God." Mark Irons, EWTN News In Depth.
Mark described the heinous Tree of Life synagogue shooting in his report. It happened 3 years ago this week, when a white supremacist opened fire inside a Jewish synagogue in Pittsburgh, killing 11 and wounding 6, including several Holocaust survivors. It was the deadliest act of anti-Semitism in U.S. history. On the 3-year anniversary of the mass shooting, the White House released a statement from President Biden. He said, "We must always stand up and speak out against anti-Semitism with clarity and conviction, and rally against the forces of hate in all its forms, because silence is complicity." Next, we continue our conversation about interfaith dialogue when we're joined by an expert panel at the forefront of thought about Judaism and Catholic theology. Our discussion and much more coming up.
I'm standing here on top of 2,000 years of Christian heritage.
As we get ready to commemorate All Saints and All Souls Days, we take you to one of the largest and most ancient of all underground cemeteries. A tour of the Roman catacombs is ahead. And inside one homeschool, why a Catholic mother chose to do the teaching herself. That, plus a look at why the growth in homeschooling is particularly strong among minority families. EWTN News In Depth will be back after this break.
As we continue our coverage on interreligious dialogue, we take a closer look at the Catholic Church and Israel. Welcome back to EWTN News In Depth. I'm Montse Alvarado. A book that dives into this subject is Contemporary Catholic Approaches to the People, Land, and State of Israel, which is a compilation of essays by leading Catholic theologians that reflect on the theological status of the land of Israel, soon to be released. The editors of this book, Phaedra Shapiro, director of the Israel Center for Jewish-Christian Relations, and Gavin DaCosta, professor of Catholic theology at the University of Bristol, joins us now to provide greater context into this subject. Thank you so much for joining us. Phaedra, is there anti-Jewish sentiment in Catholic theological culture? What did that look like pre-Vatican II? How did it change?
Well, I think that we can say that the paradigm was what Julie Zach called the teaching of contempt, where it was kind of taken for granted that the Jews were being punished by God for the crucifixion, that the church had replaced the Jewish people in God's economy of salvation, and that the significance of Judaism was that it really didn't have any significance any longer. And that all kind of fit together quite neatly until the Shoah and the Holocaust and the devastating implications of those kinds of teachings really forced the church to look carefully into those ways of thinking. Vatican II brought about many changes, and in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, what we might call a Copernican revolution, where teachings that had been absolutely taken for granted before were really turned 180 degrees, where it was no longer taken for granted that the church had triumphed over Judaism. It was no longer taken for granted that the Jews were forever to blame for Jesus's death.
But they were part of it.
And this was really brought about looking more at scripture than at church tradition.
That's right. And why is this critical then to the preservation and practice of both religious traditions together?
Well, one of the most sort of exciting pieces, I think, that comes out of Nostra Aetate is the realization that there is something Jewish at the heart or at the root of the Catholic Church. Nostra Aetate says very clearly that when the church searches into its own mystery, its own deep identity, there is something that connects it to the Jewish people. And so for Catholics, seeking a deeper understanding of their own church, their own faith, their own roots, Judaism does have significance. And by learning more about Judaism, there is a way to draw into a closer relationship, we might say, with Jesus with the Holy Family, with the apostles, who were Jewish and lived Jewish lives.
That's right, getting to know Jesus Christ by understanding how he lived his faith and his everyday life. Gavin, you have a very specific role consulting with the UK bishops on interfaith relations. Have you seen any tension between Catholics and non-Christians?
With non-Christians generally, as opposed to Jews, in fact, the opposite has happened. I think because the UK is an increasingly secular culture, there's a sense in which the religious communities together have, in many ways, come together on social political issues to speak out on behalf of the poor. Certainly when national tragedies happen, such as the bombing that took place in London, it was primarily the Jewish, Muslim, and Christian communities that headed the response to bring people together, to pray for the injured, to try and give a kind of witness that religions are not at each other's throats or necessarily destructive towards each other. So in many respects in the UK, there's a very good level of cooperation. And there has been increasingly also with the Eastern religious communities that are quite different from the Jewish community, of course, in terms of location and background. So there are Hindus and Sikhs and, in England in very large numbers in the north, and the Bishops' Committee has been very focused on reaching out, participating when they can in terms of congratulations at religious festivals, sending messages that show a level of solidarity without in any sense compromising the uniqueness of the Catholic tradition. But go on.
In looking at Catholic tradition, then, in an interview last week with News in Depth, Bishop Mansour of the Maronite Rite mentioned that religious minorities in the Middle East, and Christians in particular, can't flourish under majority Muslim rule. What does history tell us about that, just majority religious rule?
Well, it's an interesting question in terms of, turning the camera around and looking at any religion when it's been in a majority power, how other groups have fared. And of course, in terms of when Catholics were majority rule in very many parts of Europe and the state and the church were united, then the whole question of religious liberty for other groups was at stake. I think the interview you're referring to certainly picks up the dire state of Christian communities in the Middle East and religious freedoms in the Middle East. So, moving out of the UK situation and looking at it more globally, the Catholic Church, pretty well since John Paul II, has been carefully orchestrating the whole concern for interreligious dialogue with interreligious freedom, and especially in certain Muslim countries where religious freedom of Christians to practice is really quite a difficult situation. So that it's a matter of kind of making sure that the communication channels are kept open to develop the goals of Catholic practice religious freedoms, but also to give support to other communities who have those difficulties in those countries.
That's right. Phaedra, do you have any comments, this is part of your daily life, of how religious groups can thrive when a majority religion is in power and the history of that within the church?
Well, I'd like to think that the problem is religion plus power, that the problem isn't religion itself. Church power in history, as we know, has not been especially good news for the Jews and for other religious minorities. However, it's not obvious to me that the answer is kind of relegating religion to the back room and to have a really aggressively secular state, a watertight division between religion and state. I'm speaking to you from Israel, where we're sort of trying, however imperfectly, to maintain a state that is both Jewish, with a religious majority, and at the same time democratic. And those ideals are definitely in some tension. And we fail at it quite often, but it does provide for the possibility and even, sometimes the reality of a religious majority state that preserves and protects the religious freedoms of our minorities here.
Gavin, in discussing what Phaedra just said about political power, did the 2018 U.S. Embassy move to Jerusalem change anything for Christian-Jewish relations abroad?
Yes, I mean, I think in some respects what it did was to polarize some of the attitudes, certainly in the Middle East, of putting Christians on the spot because they were asked to comment on this. And every possible move that is made by the US or European powers always impacts local church communities in the Middle East. Because when those moves are perceived, I'm not saying they are, when they're perceived to be against Arab interests or the rights of the Palestinian people, then it means that the Christian communities are put in situations where either they speak out and say, yeah, this is justifiable, and then have to live with some very difficult repercussions. So in many respects, I think the kind of speaking out in Middle Eastern countries by Christians is always highly complicated because of the power dynamics that already Phaedra has alluded to.
Well, thank you both. I know we look forward to following the release of your upcoming book and to following your dialogue as you continue walking us through these issues.
Thank you.
There is no doubt that the coronavirus pandemic lit a fuse to the rocket of homeschooling. We have seen the numbers absolutely double and in some cases triple in many states all over the country.
Next, homeschooling. A deep dive into the surging education trend in America when EWTN News In Depth returns.
A lot of the things is doing some history on a lot of the saints and during that time, what was going on during that time that the saints were living, or what do they have in common with them? So those are always good discussions.
Discussing the saints in their school curriculum. Homeschooling allows families to include religion where public schools do not, incorporating prayer, the catechism, and church history into their education and tailoring it to their child's learning style. The U.S. Census Bureau says homeschooling doubled in less than a 5-month span with the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. The growing trend of families teaching their children at home is rising, particularly among the Hispanic and Black communities. One Latino mother shares her reasons for educating her children at home in our This Catholic Life report.
The two factors that led me to homeschooling, one for my oldest is having more time to do more fun things so she can be a kid. And for my younger one, it's getting her the help that she needed.
Gisela Quiñones, founder of the Latinos Homeschooling Group, says she began homeschooling years prior to the pandemic because of concerns about her children's educational needs being met and their quality of life.
Focus on what their talents are.
She also wanted her children to have a better understanding of their Latino roots.
We would reserve a room in a library, and there a couple moms and I would give classes on just art from like Panama. We would give a brief geography and history discussion on different countries in Latin America.
As the pandemic swept across the nation and schools were forced to hold classes online.
That's when a lot of people from the country started joining the group online.
Many families began homeschooling and continued even after lockdowns were lifted.
Homeschooling growing across all ethnic groups, Hispanic, Black, Asian, in tremendous numbers. We have seen the numbers absolutely double and in some cases triple in many states all over the country.
The U.S. Census Bureau says that 11.1% of families with school-aged children were homeschooled at the start of the 2020 school year, double from the spring of the 2019 school year when it was 5.4%. Not only are the numbers steadily growing for homeschooling, so are the resources.
We see tremendous infrastructure support, and it's growing. Curriculum companies have grown and are growing, and new ideas are starting. You see lots of people providing tutoring services.
And an opportunity to incorporate faith into a family's day.
At 3:00, we would do Divine Mercy. So we would, the Chaplet of Divine Mercy. So that was really nice to get my children and another family. We would call each other at 3:00, stop whatever we were doing, and pray together.
Our coverage of this issue was based on an article written by our colleague Loretta Brown of the National Catholic Register. Loretta, thank you for joining us to share what you discovered. We heard Gisela Quiñones in this piece say that she wanted to meet the needs of her children. What did you discover as you were writing this piece?
So many of the parents I talked to had initial reasons for homeschooling related to the pandemic. They talked about masking throughout the day at school, including during sports and things, and disruptive schedules of in-person and virtual learning kind of mixed in a way that was just they didn't feel that was good for their kids. But it was interesting because they talked to me about how as they actually started homeschooling, they really got to experience and learn about their child and the way their child learns. Many of them found undiagnosed learning problems and really loved that they were able to customize things into what their child was learning and grow closer as a family. People talked about that, about being able to impart the faith. So it's interesting. I mean, some of their reasons sounded like they shifted as they actually got into it. They saw, this is so good for my child and good for my family.
Rediscovering their children, rediscovering who they are as a family. I know you mentioned praying together was something that happened often as well. What do you think about this demographic? I know you and I are both Latinas, right? The future of the church. How does homeschooling serve the future of the church?
Well, I was really impressed with the Latinos homeschooling group. I talked to some of the moms in that, and the emphasis on they had bilingual education options and learning about Hispanic heritage and history. And it was really cool to see that they're really customizing their learning to being able to include things like that. And I think it shows, family values, but also tradition is important. They want to impart those things. And also, I mean, just like anyone, they want the best education for their child. And many of these parents I talked to discussed things about, bad school options and testing requirements, different things that they disagreed with or had trouble with. And they just were so happy to be able to really focus on their child and help their child thrive in areas where maybe they didn't have the best options in terms of schools.
Right, and I know our church teaches that the parent is the primary educator, so rediscovering that calling for these parents is also a great opportunity. There are different studies and findings about the effects of homeschooling on the quality of education, like you mentioned, but also their performance. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so there have been recent studies. I think a growing body of research is showing that homeschoolers have very positive outcomes in terms of academics, and I know there was a recent review of peer-reviewed studies that I kind of took a look at, and it showed that 11 out of 14 peer-reviewed studies were showing that homeschoolers were outperforming, more conventionally schooled children on testing, academic outcomes. And then there was another review that I looked at, just a review of existing studies, that showed that college GPA and college retention were also better, that had better outcomes among homeschooled children.
Well, that's very encouraging. Thank you so much, Loretta, both for your piece and for coming here to explain this to us.
Thanks for having me, Montse.
Of course. To provide context on a broader level of the impact of homeschooling on the Catholic school system, we're joined now by Mary Pat Donahoe, Executive Director, Secretariat of Catholic Education for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Mary Pat, the pandemic has ushered in an interesting time for Catholic schools, with enrollment going up, with the backdrop of various schools closing down alongside parishes. Has homeschooling impacted this in any way?
Montse, yes, thank you. There have certainly been impacts to our Catholic schools, and I'm sure that the move of many parents, the decision to homeschool, has been a factor in that. However, I will say that this entire experience, I think, has invited our schools to think a little differently about Catholic education, so that we recognize families who make the choice to homeschool are still engaging in Catholic education. And we have situations wherein many of our schools are looking at creative ways to partner with those families, since it certainly does support the church's teaching that the parent is the primary educator.
So then supporting and creating these collaborative environments. A majority of these Catholic schools are comprised of minority students, a demographic where home education is really starting to grow. How do you think the growth in homeschooling will impact the Catholic school system in this way in terms of outreach to minority families?
Sure. Well, I think for one thing, it certainly will cause us to pay even more attention to those trends and to what minority families are actually looking for. Oftentimes, I think it's a huge error to make assumptions, even based on experiences that are, becoming old. But as the world changes, as the culture and the climate changes, we need to be engaged and listening to all of our families, and especially to our minority families, since they are traditionally underserved by Catholic schools, although there is great interest in them to receive Catholic education. Are there specific differences that you've seen in those needs that they have for their children or even for their families? I think it's the same as fundamentally most parents are looking for. They want something, they want to trust that the school that they choose is going to support their values and morals, that they want to partner with us to form their children in a way that they can be happy in this world, but also learn to serve others, to find their joy in being who God created them to be. So I think that's a pretty universal concept. Now, it changes a bit in areas where, for example, in the Southwest, where we have a growing immigrant population, but very, very little infrastructure. We just don't have a whole lot of schools. We have a lot of schools in the Northeast and a shrinking population. So the invitation here is to think creatively about how Catholic education can be delivered to families if it's not possible to put them in a traditional brick and mortar school. And we're beginning to see those types of models emerge, hybrid models and other types of approaches.
A lot of the time we hear people paint this very dire picture of Catholic schools with exactly what you're describing. Some places are shutting down, some places need to open up. Can you give us hope in terms of what we're expecting and what this shift really means for Catholic schools?
Absolutely. Well, there's tremendous hope. First of all, the Holy Spirit is always active and working and inviting and calling us. We are seeing a couple of trends that I think are wonderful for Catholic schools writ large and for our families. And one of those is the desire of more and more of our schools and dioceses to rediscover the Church's beautiful and rich and unique educational tradition and sort of represent that with the understanding that much of modern American education is founded on philosophies that are, in opposition in many ways to what the Church believes about the formation of children. I think that's a great sign of hope. The recognition of parents as primary educators, they themselves have recognized because they have seen things differently during a pandemic, certainly is a strength and a call for all of us to partner together in this critical time to form children. And again, as I said, to be conscious that the needs of emerging communities, the needs of immigrant communities may be different. And the Church can find a way, as it always has for centuries, to respond that may look different than the brick and mortar structures that we have had for so many decades.
That's right. Well, coming together and collaborating through this synodal process that we all have to be a part of to find the right answers to these questions. Thank you so much, Mary Pat.
Absolutely, Montse. It was wonderful to be with you.
Same here. God bless you.
God bless. Thank you.
For resources on homeschooling, head over to EWTN.com and type in homeschooling into the search bar to find a list of catalogs, websites, Catholic textbooks, and more. Top headlines in the Week in Review are next.
We need stronger rules to protect children online, real transparency, real accountability. I want a market where the competition is to protect children, not to exploit them.
Big tech on the hot seat. Executives from Snapchat, TikTok, and YouTube defend their policies as leaders on Capitol Hill ask tough questions about whether their social media platforms are harming children. And the Queen cancels another public appearance, raising continued questions about her health. EWTN News In Depth is coming right back.
Concern about big tech and the harm it might be doing to children tops the Week in Review. As tech executives were grilled this week during hearings on Capitol Hill, executives from YouTube, TikTok, and Snapchat said they have tools in place to limit screen time, hide children's profiles from strangers, and limit marketing to kids. But the social media platforms have been misused to harm children by promoting bullying, eating disorders, and inappropriate sexual relationships with predators.
It seems like every day that I hear stories about kids and teens who are suffering after interacting with TikTok, YouTube, and Snapchat. Your parents, how can you allow this? How can you allow this?
The Senate panel wants to learn how algorithms can magnify harm to children, foster addiction, and invade privacy. Senators say they're working towards legislation to protect young people. This hearing about the dangers of social media came as we're learning more from a massive leak of internal Facebook information. A whistleblower shared Facebook's own research with the Securities and Exchange Commission and with a consortium of 17 U.S. news organizations, each of which used the documents for their own reporting projects, which they began releasing this week. Among the overall findings common to all the reporting, Facebook's algorithms fuel divisiveness and anger. The more negative the comments, the more likely the post will get clicked and shared. Facebook has been instrumental in spreading anti-vaccination misinformation and false information about election fraud. Unmonitored Facebook posts have sparked international violence and hate speech in at-risk countries around the globe. Facebook has acknowledged it hasn't done enough to prevent bloodshed overseas. Global oversight is inadequate. Facebook does not have the staff to moderate content in the 100 different languages currently on the platform, and human trafficking is rampant on Facebook. Traffickers, recruiters, and facilitators all use Facebook products, including Instagram, Messenger, and WhatsApp, for human exploitation. CEO Mark Zuckerberg is pushing back against the Facebook papers' reporting. He says the internal research is being cherry-picked to present a misleading narrative about the company. As we discussed at the beginning of this program, much of the world's attention will be focused on Glasgow, Scotland, when the 26th Conference of Parties, or COP26, Climate Summit begins on Sunday. Presidents and prime ministers from around the world will gather to discuss global warming. In the run-up to the meeting, the UN Secretary General said time is running out to cut greenhouse gases.
The clock is ticking. The emissions gap is the result of a leadership gap, but leaders can still make this a turning point to a greener future instead of a tipping point to climate catastrophe.
Guterres said leaders need to step up and their governments need to stop making vague promises about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The UN considers 2021 a make-or-break year to act to prevent man-made climate disasters. Though she was scheduled to kick off the Glasgow summit by greeting world leaders at an opening reception, Buckingham Palace announced on Tuesday that Queen Elizabeth II had canceled her planned engagement at the UN climate conference. She will, instead, accept her doctor's advice to rest. Last week, the Queen was hospitalized overnight for medical tests, though the nature of those tests has not been disclosed. The 95-year-old monarch is seen here walking with a cane at an appearance earlier this month, the first time she has used a cane in public since knee surgery in 2003. The palace says she will now greet the world leaders by recorded video message. An advisory panel to the FDA voted in favor this week of authorizing COVID-19 Pfizer vaccines for children ages 5 to 11. The vote comes just 10 months after adults in the U.S. started receiving coronavirus vaccines. The advisory panel voted 17-0 with one abstention to make the recommendation, saying the benefits of the shot outweigh the risks. The full FDA and CDC will weigh in next. If approved, the lower dose, 2-shot Pfizer vaccine for children could be available as early as next week. Vatican City has started to provide COVID booster shots to its 800 residents and more than 4,000 employees. The nation-state has provided Pfizer vaccines since January. Priority for the boosters is being given to the vulnerable and those over the age of 60. Popes Francis and Benedict received their 2 doses early this year and could be among the first to receive the booster, though a Vatican spokesman could not confirm that. After a 6-month investigation into the world's second highest COVID death toll, a Brazilian Senate committee voted this week to recommend President Jair Bolsonaro face criminal charges for crimes against humanity. More than 600,000 people have died of COVID in Brazil, and the investigation found Bolsonaro openly challenged health protocols, delayed acquisition of vaccines, and defended drugs that don't work against coronavirus. As recently as last week, Bolsonaro said the COVID vaccine could cause AIDS, a claim that Facebook and YouTube took down this week. Bolsonaro denies he's done anything wrong and said the report is the work of his political enemies. The Senate recommendation must now go to Brazil's Prosecutor General, a Bolsonaro appointee, who will decide whether any charges will be filed. On Tuesday, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee held a virtual hearing for nominees to several positions, including the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Rashid Hussain made this case for his role.
In an era of vigorous partisan debates, Americans continue to be largely of one mind regarding the importance of defending international religious freedom. If confirmed, I will work closely with the members of this committee and your staffs to extend this right to all. I will also leverage my existing relationships with Muslim-majority countries to protect the rights of religious minorities there. I will redouble efforts to broaden the coalition to hold China accountable for its horrific crimes against the Uyghurs and its repression of other ethnic and religious minorities.
Rashid Hussain formerly worked at the White House, at the National Security Council, and as a prosecutor at the Justice Department, among many other roles in his career. Here to provide his expert insight on what the role of Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom means on a global level is Professor Robert George, Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions and McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence at Princeton University. He's also former chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Robbie, it's so great to have you here. Welcome to News in Depth. What moved you to co-author this piece with former Religious Freedom Ambassador Rabbi Saperstein defending Rashid Hussain?
The position of Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom is a very important one. The Ambassador at Large is the advocate within the government, within the administration, within the State Department for international religious freedom. That means he's the advocate for persecuted and oppressed people, people of faith who are suffering for their faith, all over the world, wherever the United States does foreign policy, wherever it does business, whether we're talking about persecuted people in China, in Thailand, Burma, Saudi Arabia, Somalia, Sudan, Vietnam, Korea, you name it, where people are being persecuted, their advocate within our government is the Religious Freedom Ambassador. Now remember, Montse, there are certain interests, perfectly valid interests for perfectly valid reasons, who will always have advocates within our government. The business community will have advocates within the government. Our military leadership will have advocates within the government. We need to make sure, and this was the whole point of creating in 1998 the Office of Ambassador at Large, we need an advocate for persecuted people, for people of faith, who are suffering for their beliefs around the world. And that's the role of the ambassador. We have a good nominee here. I'm not a Joe Biden supporter. That probably won't come as a big surprise to folks. I'm a pretty sharp critic.
Our viewers won't be surprised, I promise.
But in this case, he's nominated a good man. Rashid is very well qualified. His heart is very good, and it's in the right place. He's someone who will defend the rights of persecuted people, whether they're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu, no matter what they are around the world. He'll be a good advocate within the administration for them and for the cause of religious freedom. And that's why I joined with Rabbi Saperstein, who, like me, had a term as chairman of U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and also was himself the ambassador at large for religious freedom. He tends to be on the Democratic and liberal side. I'm on the Republican and conservative side. But we have common ground here because we know Rashid, we know what his heart is, we know the work he's done, we know the experience and ability he has, so we're jointly speaking out in his support.
I think that's fantastic, and it's a great example for us where people who can disagree on the fundamental truths about life but come together on this essential human right, religious freedom, properly understood. Your advocacy for this freedom, religious freedom for all religious traditions, it's nothing new. How does your Catholic faith inspire that defense, Robbie?
Well, the Catholic Church teaches in the document Dignitatis Humanae, the dignity of the human being, the dignity of man, of the Second Vatican Council, that every human being, every person, irrespective of any characteristic, including religious faith, has the fundamental right to religious freedom. And that's got to be honored by governments, and it's got to be protected by governments. The idea here is that the right to raise fundamental questions, to answer those questions honestly. Fundamental questions, I mean questions of meaning and value, questions of ultimacy, questions of spirituality. Is there a God? If so, how do we bring ourselves into proper relationship with God? Answering those questions honestly, and then living with authenticity and integrity in view of one's best answers to those questions. That set of rights we call compendiously the right to religious freedom. And the Catholic Church boldly and unambiguously teaches that this is a right that every human being has. And that means that when that right comes under attack, irrespective of the source from which the attack comes, secular, religious, political, you name it, it's our obligation as believers, as Christians, as Catholics, to speak out for those who are being persecuted, even when they are not members of our particular faith. And so I and you and the Becket Fund and all our friends in the religious freedom movement, we're in the vanguard speaking out not only when it's the faith of our fellow Catholics that's being persecuted, but when it's the faith of our Jewish friends, when it's the faith of our Protestant friends, when it's the faith of our Muslim friends, our Buddhist friends, our Hindu friends. These are all members of the human family, irrespective of their faith. And as members of the human family, they have a fundamental right to religious liberty, or so the Catholic faith teaches us.
That's right. That's exactly right. Thank you so much, Robbie. Pope Francis is considering an invitation from Canada from the Canadian bishops as a gesture towards Catholic Church reconciliation with Indigenous people. Pope Francis is already set to meet with Native Canadian tribes at the Vatican in December after the discovery of unmarked graves of Indigenous children at a former Catholic-run school in British Columbia. The Canadian Bishops' Conference apologized for the Church's role in the residential school system and said it's working toward a papal visit to Canada as part of the healing journey. No word yet on a date for the potential visit. Papal advice to reignite your spiritual life. During his general audience on Wednesday, Pope Francis told the faithful to heed Paul's advice and place ourselves in front of our Savior, whether we sit in front of a crucifix or take time for adoration before his real presence in the Eucharist. The Holy Father also referenced St. Paul's list of fruits of the Spirit, including love, joy, patience, kindness, suggesting that we meditate on whether our own life and behavior corresponds and bears these fruits. We would like to take a moment now to remember someone very dear to this program and the EWTN network. It was 1 year ago that we lost Andrew Walther, president of EWTN News, on All Saints' Day. The father of 4 and husband to Maureen, Andrew was an instrumental man in envisioning this program, which launched just months after his death. Before coming to EWTN, Andrew was the Vice President of Communications and Strategic Planning for the Knights of Columbus and played a leading role as the Knights defended persecuted religious minorities around the world. Andrew was passionate about the defense of life and the persecuted church in the Middle East. We're grateful for his Catholic witness and his dedication to serving our church. We pray for his young family and for the repose of his soul and ask you to join us in those prayers. This weekend will bring costumes and candy galore, but it wasn't always this way. Dating back centuries, Hallows Eve falls on the evening before All Saints' Day, in which Roman Catholics and other Christians around the world honor saints in heaven. The next day, our church commemorates All Souls' Day, in which we pray for all souls, including those in purgatory, waiting to get into heaven. As we close, we take you to a historic place where thousands of bodies lie in repose, awaiting their entrance to heaven. EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief Andreas Tannhauser takes us into the Roman catacombs in our Images of the Week.
We're here in the middle of Rome in one of the many parks of the city on top of a hill. And I'm literally standing here on top of 2,000 years of Christian heritage. Today is the day of the catacombs, and many people, especially children, have come to reveal and to see the hidden treasures of the city beneath the city. Let's take a look and see what these catacombs have to offer.
Rome, the underground, a city hidden beneath the eternal city,
a place of death, but also worship. The catacombs are a network of more than 19 miles of tunnels. They include 50 cemeteries. And this is where the first Christians hid from persecution and where they buried their dead. Domitilla Catacombs is one of the largest and most ancient of these underground cemeteries. And its origins go back to the year 120. This is the only catacomb in Rome which has an underground basilica. It is dedicated to the holy martyrs Nerio and Achilleo. Frescoes on the walls of the catacomb tunnels, the gravestones and inscriptions contain messages from the first Christian communities. During the severe persecutions in ancient Roman times, they had to live and die in these dark places. The remnants of their paintings and sculptures, however, tell of a hope beyond death as they await the resurrection of the body when Jesus would return. Andreas Tonhauser from Rome for EWTN News In Depth.
A rare moment to have a camera crew inside the catacombs. Let's pray together for those we remember and hold dear on All Souls Day this Tuesday. I'm Montse Alvarado. Thank you for watching EWTN News In Depth. We hope to see you again this time next week when we'll dive into the Global Synod on Synodality. See you then.